Hello there everyone, and welcome to this Barbed, Castaway, Riptide deck tech. I figured it'd been a little while since I'd done a Riptide deck. So if you've seen my other Riptide video that I recently did on Manta, you'll be maybe asking, oh, why Barbed, Castaway, Riptide? Well, compared to the Red Spine Manta list, this is much more of a mid-range approach to playing Riptide, and so you have a lot more agency in how you play because you block a little bit better, you have more disruption, so you've got a bit more of like a comeback mechanic. So you basically have a bit more of a smoother matchup spread, but some less favourable matchups as a result. And if you've watched all my Barbed, Castaway, Riptide deck techs at this point, then I'm sorry, because you've probably heard me say these things 100 times, but there are some new things in here. If you're new to Barbed Castaway, I call it Barbed Castaway because the bow's called Barbed Castaway. In Ranger, we like to name the decks after the bow we play. You'll see it's got two effects, both are instants, and both require you to pay one. The second effect, where you get to load, the first effect, where you get to load at instant speed, you're rarely going to use this one compared to the second one. The second one is the main reason to play this deck, and I'll get into it later. For the Quiver, I'm playing Driftwood Quiver. In previous iterations of this list, I was playing Quiver of Abyssal Depths, just because it meant I could get back 2 Dominate arrows and maybe like an Endless, which is actually, in theory, more useful than just getting back 3 arrows that apparently help with fatigue, but they don't actually. However, after several hundred games on Barbed, Castaway, Riptide, I realised I never actually used the Quiver. I was never getting fatigued, I was never having to recycle these cards, especially now that stuff like News left the meta. The games never came down to that. And so I've decided to run Driftwood Quiver instead of the Abyssal Depths Quiver, just because it gives me a bit more flexibility on how I use my arsenal. And in this deck, the way you use arsenal is very, very important. The chess piece is Fienro's Spring Tunic. The yellow and blue count compared to other Riptide decks is actually quite high because we have to pay for things, and so Tunic really helps to fix that cost curve. It also lets us do a lot of powerful things as well. I'll just quickly scroll through the deck here to just point some of them out. So as with the Manta list, if you play a Codex and then you fire a Heat Seeker and it hits, you've got a Ponder, you've hit for 5 damage, you've drawn an extra card that you're putting face up into your arsenal, and you've also given them a Frailty. That is just insane value. But the main reason to play Tunic in this deck is for giving the aim counters with Barbed Castaway, because it costs 1 to give an aim counter, and paying 1 to give an aim counter, if you're paying a whole card for it, is just a terrible rate. If I take an example of Stone Rain here, this card is basically one of your 2 win conditions alongside Murky Water. If it has an aim counter, it gets Dominate, and when it hits, opponent gets Intimidated till the end of their turn. If you play a buff, put this into your arsenal, and then pay a whole card to give this an aim counter, that's insanely below rate. If you play a buff, put this into your arsenal, and give an aim counter with Tunic, it's now above rate. So it's quite straightforward, really. The arm piece is Long Draw. I really like Long Draw. I see a lot of aimless play Sharpshooters. I don't like Sharpshooters because the only time you'd use Sharpshooters is if you don't have a buff in your hand, because then you can't get the arrow face down to then flip it with Barbed Castaway. If that's the case, that's probably one of the worst arrows I'm ever going to fire, so I don't want Sharpshooters because it doesn't actually give me a good turn. It just makes you feel like maybe you've had a good turn, but I'd rather just block, arsenal, and reset. What Long Draw does is, well, it plays around Warmongers, but no one plays that anymore, but for future, just in case. And it also fixes half of the deck, because you need to see arrows, you need to see buffs. If you don't see arrows, you can't do anything. If you don't see buffs, as I said in the Manta Riptide deck tech, you have Long Draw Half Glove for that. It also blocks 1, so alongside our Sealay Sarong, which blocks 2, we're now covering up 3, and then we can just give 1 more card and we cover up a CNC. This is very, very useful into decks like KO, who will maybe send quite a lot of damage early on, and you maybe want to block it out, but you can then keep just 1 card in hand that you're willing to block with to then cover up their last bit of disruption, if they have it. Now, I'll speak about Sarong here as well. The effect to give blue arrows go again is incredibly useful. So it does a myriad of things for this deck. Firstly, we're naturally on a higher blue count because we need to pay for things like some of our buffs. Murky Water costs 2, we're playing some more 1 costs in the deck. So we just naturally run blues. And because we naturally run blues, that makes Sarong make sense. I wouldn't run blues because of Sarong. I run blues, so I run Sarong. This makes your matchups into gravy so much better. It lets you utilize a lot of your, if a lot of times you'll have tempo in this deck, and traditionally you couldn't quite make full use of it, but now because you have Sarong, you can go buff, blue arrow, go again, buff, buff, arrow, and it just lets you use your hands a lot more efficiently. It also means that whenever you ponder a blue arrow, you don't have to pay 1 to flip it up, give an aim counter, and then this silly arrow just sits there. you give it a go again, you fire it out, and you instantly ask questions of your opponent. So this big upgrade for the deck. And then lastly, New Horizons got a reprint, so get your hands on one if you don't. It is, in my opinion, easily the best headpiece you can run for Riptide. It pairs so well with Barbed Castaway. It's like Barbed Castaway is basically Lexi's ability, but you have to pay for it, and you get something for it, but you also don't get as much as Lexi did. However, it was clearly meant to be designed with New Horizons, so they complement each other well, and also being able to value pipe in this deck is super important. So if I see a Murky Water and I've got just traps, then being able to play a trap, reload the Murky, flip it face up with an end counter, and then just arsenal a trap and wait for a better hand is a very, very good play to be able to make. And New Horizons allows that. It also blocks too, so at the end of the game you can cash in some extra life as well. The value this thing gets you over the course of a game, which in Barbed Castaway Riptide is even more because you're mid-range, so the games are longer, is crazy. I'll now move on to the main deck. There's a few new things in here. If you've seen my other aim list, you'll see some returning favourites. I'll just go through the favourites first, just quickly. So the red arrows are Red Drill Shot, Endless Arrow, Heat Seeker, Murky Water, and Stone Rain, as you can all see there. These are the ones that I've always ran. The value on them is just insane. Murky Water, this card here, in case you haven't seen it, is one of your main win conditions because it gets Dominate when you give it an aim counter. It also has another on hit, which is very, very strong. And then the previously discussed Stone Rain as well. So these two cards are your primary win conditions because going wide in this deck is quite difficult. So if you don't have access to Murky Water and Stone Rain, you're actually incredibly fatigable and your opponent has a lot of agency in how they control the game. But because you have Stone Rain and Murky Water, your other arrows become tempo plays and very good value plays, and they let you set these kind of things up. There's a reason Barbed Castaway didn't exist as a deck until Stone Rain and Murky Water came out, and that's because it really needed something like these to have evasion. Now there are a few new cards in here. The first one I'll talk about is Red Bolt and Shot. This card has been very, very good in this list. It improves your gravy matchup because now you can clear allies a bit more easily. You don't just have to rely on Sarong. But also it lets you set up another way to ask difficult questions of your opponent. So now you don't just rely on Dominate. If you have a Red Bolt and Shot, a buff, and a red Endless Arrow, that as a 4-card hand is incredibly threatening and very above rate and very difficult to block out. So it just gives the deck a different axis to play on. You can also hold on it and keep it face up in Arsenal, wait until you draw like another arrow, 2 buffs, a codex, and then you can have like a really, really wide turn. So it just lets you play on a different axis, and I think that's very important for the deck because it means you're not just sitting there waiting for your Dominate arrows anymore. You can present a lot of threats without them. And I'll talk about the blue arrows next. There's Blue Drill Shot. It's probably my favourite blue arrow because when you send this at your opponent, they either give you armor, which is amazing, they either block with a card from hand, which is amazing, or they don't block and you just put a -1 counter on armor. All three of those scenarios I'm happy with, and if you have this in your arsenal, send it just for 2 go again at the start of a turn before you send anything meaningful, then you're actually asking some very difficult questions of your opponent. The other 2 blue arrows, Intoxicating Shot, it's a 0 for 4 if your opponent blocks it out. It's a 0 for 3 if they let it hit into some decks, because most of the time the Quicken token doesn't actually matter, it's the Courage token. But this is a very strong arrow, especially in the late game when you and your opponent both on low life. Very important arrow. And then the last one is Widowmaker. A lot of people like to play Blue Infecting Shot in this slot, but I think Widowmaker is better, and I'm about to make a case for why. So firstly, into Gravy, it is a 1 for 5, go again with Sarong. Now the 5, it doesn't really matter except into something like a Swabby, because if you fire an Infecting Shot for 3 going again into Swabby and they have the Fearless Confrontation, you're in an awful spot. So this comfortably covers a Swabby just by itself, but also this, with a Pump, will clear a Humperdinck and a Chump safely without having to worry about Fearless Confrontation. So if you fire Infecting Shot and a Pump into a Chump and they have the Fearless Confrontation, you're very sad. So this just insulates you from it, and it costs 1 as well, the same as Infecting Shot, so it might feel bad that you're losing 2 extra value, but you're not really in practice. And it also has the effect, defense reactions can't be played to Widowmaker's Chainlink. This is sometimes useful, not so much, but when it's your only arrow and you're playing to Earth and you just play pump, 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 fire this with your Tunic counter and they've got 2D reacts, then that's very good. In the early game, Widowmaker is very, very strong because your opponent is super incentivized to block this with their armor, which again is fantastic because it means my actual good on hits get through. So let's talk about this compared to Infected Shot when it comes to damage. If our opponent has, in the late game, some Battle 1 equipment, and they just give a card from hand and battle-worn equipment. They've blocked 3, and Widowmaker is not coming for 5, it's coming for 2, but our opponent still blocked 3. If we send in a blue Infecting Shot, it's coming for 3 go again. Our opponent just gives a card. They've also blocked it out. However, if Widowmaker hits, if my opponent doesn't provide any blocks, it comes in for 5. If it's the same for Infecting Shot, it also comes in for 5 eventually, but it means that our opponent has now a token, a Blood Rot token, and that's relevant for things such as the new card from Super Slam. I can't remember what it's called, but it's the one that blocks for tokens, plus how many tokens are on the field. And it's also relevant for Vincent because she now has something to dirge as well. So the actual damage output of the 2 cards is it's actually identical really. And if our opponent doesn't have any battle-worn armor, then blocking out Widowmaker is actually harder. And because it no longer gets the +3 and our opponent gives 2 cards, that kind of feels rough. So a lot of times your opponent will just let this hit, because for some reason Blood Rots feel a lot more threatening as well. So I think the damage on this is actually the exact same, and there's just more scenarios in which this is relevant. Like the ceiling on it's better, and I think the floor on it's better. The one thing that's better with the blue Infecting Shot is that you can give it an encounter and it gets +1, but I don't know, 1 for 4 without go again on a blue is okay, but it's a 2 card play that's quite clunky to actually make use of. To quickly talk about the buffs, 3 Premeditate, 3 Seek and Destroy in the main board. These are your best buffs by a mile. Seek and Destroy in a deck that likes to use Dominates is very strong because it keeps your opponent off an arsenal, and Seek and Destroy also pairs well with Stone Rain because they're both your triggers, and so when you hit someone with a Stone Rain and it has Seek and Destroy, the card that they banish goes to grave during the end step, if you order your triggers right, which you should. For the yellow buffs, I'm playing Deadeye and Line It Up. Line It Up might seem a little bit redundant, but giving 2 encounters in 1 turn is very, very relevant, more so than you'd think. And the yellow pumps are just like the glue for the deck. They block 3, they buff by 3, they cost 1, but they kind of fit the curve quite nicely because it lets you utilize your blues a bit more, and they pump for 3. So they just do everything, and they pitch for 2 as well. And then the better of the 2 I'd say is Deadeye. This gives your Stone Rain such a good on-hit, and also gives Murky Water a very good on-hit as well, because if you pair this with Murky Water and you see a CNC in their hand and you put a trap into your arsenal, well, you just get rid of the CNC and now they have to attack into you and you can use the trap. It's just very good disruption, and cards like Deadeye are probably the main reason why you want to play Barbed Castaway over Manta, because the disruption you get is a lot better, and this is one of the reasons for it. And lastly in the main board, Codex of Frailty. It's as strong in this deck as the other versions of Riptide. Obviously it's a must play. Onto the sideboard now, and you'll see that there's quite a lot going on here. So I'll just talk about the pumps first. I'm playing 3 copies of Drop the Anchor. Gravy is still alive and kicking, despite technically being dead, because, you know, his pirate crew's dead. Anyway, it's probably one of your harder matchups, and Drop the Anchor just means that when you get kind of below that 20 life threshold, like both of you do, then if you start seeing some good arrows, you can just start hitting them really hard in the face with Drop the Anchor and kind of start ignoring the allies and kill them that way. It's also just a really good tempo play as well, and it's relevant into Reviled KO and into Tough Nut as well. Both of those matchups are pretty good without this, but it does have some relevancy. It's maybe relevant into the 2 Guardians, even though they do play instant speed, you kind of force them to make a decision as to how they're going to use their hero power. And I guess it's relevant into Puffin and Marlin as well for anyone that's still playing those decks. But the floor in this is just a 0 for 3, so I love siding this in against Earth and Florian, because having 21 buffs, it feels right. It feels like you have the consistent damage to get over the top with 21. I don't know why, there's probably some mathematical formula for it. I haven't done it, I just go on vibes, it feels good. You can easily swap this out if you want, but I quite like having the gravy coverage. Lace of Blood Rot. I don't know why I have this in the sideboard, to be honest. It's always because if I come in against a Vincent, and there's quite a lot of Vincents in my local area, then I don't put this in because it lets them dead with Dirge for a lot of value. But this comes into everyone that's not Vincent, basically. It's a 0 for 5 if it hits. Really strong pump. And then the last buff that I'm playing is Release the Tension. When I spoke about Seek and Destroy, I mentioned that being able to stop D-reacts is very important, and you do that with Seek and Destroy preemptively. With this one, you can do it while they already have a D-react. So if you send Stone Rain for like 10 Dominate and you've got this on it, you know the maximum your opponent can block is 4, because if they have a D-react in hand, that's all they can use. This pairs insanely well with Seek and Destroy as well, because if they do have that D-react in grave, then the Seek and Destroy will get rid of it, and the Release the Tension means they can't play it. So really, really strong. And I like it in this deck because unlike the aggro versions of Riptide, where you maybe go 2-3 attacks wide, Release Tension is a bit redundant there because, alright, your opponent couldn't block one of the arrows, but they can block the other two. Whereas in this deck, you're mostly sending one arrow a turn, or at least one meaningful arrow a turn, and so Release the Tension, to me, makes more sense. There's only one arrow that I'm playing in the sideboard, and that's the Mage Hunter arrow. This card is very important for the Verdance matchup. It's less so important for Florian, Vincent, Kano, and Acilio. Those matchups for this deck are actually, they're decent already. This obviously helps a lot, but it's primarily in here for Verdance. So I'm playing 3 copies of it because if you saw my last deck tech, I was only playing 2 in the Manta list. That's because in the Manta list, I didn't want to sit in it for too long because I need to utilize those 6 card hands as much as possible and fire off, go wide. That's kind of the plan. Whereas in this deck, going tall is the plan. And so having this card just sitting in my arsenal face up isn't as much of a detriment. So I'm happy to see 3. It also costs 1 in a deck that runs a lot more pitch cards and a lot more ways to utilize pitching cards as well. So I don't mind running 3 for that. But yeah, this new arrow, it's really cool and it does help the Verdance matchup a lot. If you've noticed, I'm also on AB3. I'm running the Bullseye Bracers, Nullrune Boots, and Sunken Treasure. I'm running quite a lot of blues in this deck, so pitching the full 3 makes sense, but also sometimes I might just want to AB2, that's fine, and then you can use that floating resource to pay to give a name counter or pay to load. Lots of flexibilities, but because Verdance is meta, I think AB3 is very important, and having the Mage Hunter arrow means that half of her 6 cost or 6 power spells don't leak any damage if you manage to line them up with this, so very important. I'll then talk about the traps next. I'm playing Inertia Trap, Boulder Trap, Tarpit Trap, and then just 2 of the legendaries. It's the exact same lineup as the one in Manta Riptide, and for the same reasons as well. Inertia Trap and Boulder Trap are triggered when your opponent buffs an attack, and right now, literally everyone is buffing. If we think what the meta is, we've got Florian, we've got Verdance, basically all their attacks get buffed. All the new heroes from this set, Super Slam, they buff, and OG KO buffs basically every turn as well, so your traps are basically always triggering. And then Tarpit Trap is just broken. It's insanely good into decks like Gravy, Syndra, Dash.io. It kind of covers the other spectrum of decks that you're going to be seeing. And it's important in Castaway Riptide to run a certain amount of traps. You need a certain trap density so that when you hit with Murky Water, your chances of having 3 traps in grave are higher, because if you hit with Murky Water and you get a trap back, the value on that play is crazy. So I don't think if you're wanting to play a mid-range Riptide deck, you can't really go below, I'd say, 11 traps, which happens to be the number I'm running. What a coincidence. And then the last 2 traps, Buzzsaw and Collapsing Trap, I don't think they need any introduction. I will say, however, that I still think Buzzsaw is by far the better trap compared to Collapsing Trap these days. The ceiling on this thing, if your opponent, like say you're playing against the Pleiades, and they swing at you for like 20, and you have Buzzsaw Trap, you win the game on the spot. Collapsing Trap doesn't really offer that same value anymore. It's kind of been power crept a little bit. If Cat ever comes meta, Collapsing Trap, super good. It's still very good, obviously, but I prefer Buzzsaw Trap. And just to quickly touch on an honorary trap, Sink Below, it blocks 4, which is super important, but also fixes your hands. I can't stress enough how important this card is. It's just broken, it's the best E-React in the game, so why wouldn't we run it? If you're thinking we have to run traps, then imagine if this was a 0 for 3 red that just triggered and had this effect. You would play it, right? It's broken. But instead of just being 0 for 3, it's 0 for 4. You don't get the ping, but it's basically the same value. And I think 4 is a very important number, as I previously said. There is maybe an argument to run other traps because you want to get Murky Water's effect off more frequently. I don't fault you for that. I think that makes sense. I just prefer the consistency of Sink Below, especially into decks like Syndra and Dash.io. Now I've got a few weirder cards to talk about. Feign Death. This card is a really, really firm favourite of mine. I don't see many other people play it, but guys, please try it. Please try it. Insist. You'll get some results with it. So it's obviously really, really good into OG KO, because if he goes 6 go again with a Wild Ride and he's got 2 cards in hand, or maybe like a card in Arsenal, the hard thing with KO at the minute is that you don't know what he's going to end on. He could finish with the Reckless Stampede, which is horrible to block. He could finish with a CNC, with Ascend Packing, some sort of disruption. And Feign Death with Tunic is insane value in that situation. Even on something simple like a Blood Rush turn, if your opponent goes Claw into just bare Fangs for 10, just Tunic, Feign Death, 1 card 10 on defense, that's crazy. It's also very good into Verdance. If she's still trying to combo you, then it's good for that reason. And it's also good if she sends like an E-strike into something like a felling, then it gives you a lot of options there. And it's also good into flooring because in the late game he likes to go grasp into a pitch stack felling or something like that. Or if they play a Channel Mount Heroic, 3 go again, CNC, Feign Death is phenomenal there. And it's also very, very good into Kano and into Acilio as well. On Acilio's combo turn, you would traditionally just die if your Acilio opponent high rolls. However, Feign Death means that you don't die and you actually have some very good chance of comeback. And into Kano, you let the wildfire hit, you let them think they're going to win, and then they play open the floodgates, you Feign Death it, and it's game over. It's also very strong into Vincent for those people who are still playing that deck. And then the last card in the deck is Authority of Ataya. You don't have to play this card, it's really expensive, understand if you don't want to. If you want to sub this in for something else, then just play Spike Bit Trap, because it's a blue block 3 at the end of the day, so it's not terrible, even though it's not incredibly relevant. However, this card is a blue, and when it's pitched, defense reactions cost opponents additional 1 resource this turn. This card is incredibly good into the fatigue decks, I'm thinking decks like Jarl, and it's incredibly good into the earth decks, because into those decks, Verdance and Florian, the only on-hit they have is CNC. Besides CNC, everything else is just damage or effect on play, so you're not really incentivized to block a lot of time if you've got a good hand, but they do run a lot of D-reacts, and that's why those matchups tend to be a bit problematic for this deck. And so this is your answer for those decks. And Earth is very popular at the minute, so why not run this? As I said earlier, the primary win condition of this deck is the 2 Dominate arrows, and one way to counter Dominate is to play defense reactions, especially from the arsenal, and this really helps stop our opponent from doing that efficiently. And the last thing that I want to talk about is what AB do I run into Rune Blades, because I don't want to run AB3 into them. I'll run AB3 into the Wizards, and that's it. So into Rune Blade, the piece of AB that I choose to run is actually Bullseye Bracers. That's because I don't want to give up Sarong, because that card is actually very good into Flooring, and the 2 life is quite important, and I don't want to give up Tunic because it smooths your cost curve out so much that your deck becomes so much worse if you run Trench instead of Tunic. If you want to play like a Stone Rain, as I said, play a whole card to give an aim counter, that's not good. So playing Bullseye Bracers is, in my opinion, the best option for that. You have the Driftwood Quiver to clear your arsenal, you don't need the long draw for that necessarily. You can survive on just 1 arsenal clear, especially because in this deck you can so flexibly use your spare arsenal slot. And yeah, so Bullseye Bracers as the AB1 piece that I choose to go for. It also means that in the end game, if I'm trying to pressure my opponent and I see a Bolt and Shot and like 3 arrows, I can just crack Bullseye, send Bolt and Shot for 5 into an arrow. So I actually really like this into Florian. It means that you don't have to play actively worse equipment to play into Runeblade, because Null Rune Boots compared to Sarong is laughable, and Trench compared to Tunic in this deck where you need to pay for things and you like to pay for things for free, is the comparison's just not even close in my opinion. So Bullseye Bracers, very strong equipment piece to run, and it means that you're not hurting yourself playing into Runeblades by playing an equipment piece that you wouldn't run in the main board. And that is my Barbed Castaway Riptide deck for the Super Slam meta. I think you have an incredibly strong matchup into OG KO. It's actually probably one of the primary reasons to play Riptide in this meta. You have, believe it or not, a good Florian matchup. It's pretty 50-50. If you look at the results on stuff like Fab Blazing, you'll actually see that the matchup is not as good for Florian as you might expect, and it's been that way for a while. At the start it wasn't, but I think Riptide players figured out how to win in that matchup. Verdance is the tougher of the 2 Earth heroes to play against. Well, there's actually 3, but no one plays Jarl. So yeah, Verdance is the harder one to play into, but this deck you can see is kitted out to deal with Verdance. You can go for the fatigue angle if they're not on pots, or sometimes if you just get through a lot of damage early, then you can just tempo and kill them as well. And then other matchups like Syndra, you block so well, she triggers all your traps, it's quite a good matchup, and you can disrupt her very easily because she doesn't have a lot of armor. Acilio, very same logic there. Dash.io, again, you block very well, your traps disrupt, your arrows and buffs disrupt, so it's quite a good matchup. Gravy's probably the hardest one, as I mentioned before, but you can get there. It's not worse than a 40% matchup, I would say, especially not now after Tipple was banned. So you got a lot of options for playing this deck into the meta. It is quite a hard deck to pilot, so it does require quite a bit of practice. It's a bit unintuitive, and it plays very differently to basically any other ranger that you'll come across. Super fun, so I'd highly recommend it. If you have any questions, suggestions, love to hear them. Always like discussing this kind of stuff. And if you're still here after all this time, then hope you have a good day.